$75,000, cash. Take it before this place ruins you. Victor's voice was smooth, almost kind. Ethan Rourke stood on the cracked porch, a broke veteran with dust on his boots and a dog who hadn't stopped watching the old oak. "You came all this way to save me?" Ethan asked. Victor leaned closer. "No, I came before someone else finds what's buried here," Atlas growled once, low and certain. Ethan's hand tightened around the blackened key in his pocket. The stranger thought he had found a desperate man. He had found the wrong guardian. Ethan Rourke had learned that a man could survive almost anything and still be undone by a quiet morning. Not gunfire, not desert heat, not the long metallic silence after a convoy stopped moving. Just a Tuesday morning in Red Mesa, Arizona, with sunlight crawling across the kitchen floor, a coffee mug gone cold beside a stack of overdue bills, and a German shepherd watching him with the kind of patience only a dog could afford. Atlas sat near the back door, ears up, amber eyes fixed on Ethan as if he could hear the numbers adding themselves in the room. $1,200 past due on the workshop lease, $600 on the truck, 3 notices from the bank, each one thinner than the last but heavier in the hand. Ethan had $43 in his checking account and a cracked leather wallet that still held his retired military ID, folded behind a photograph of men he no longer called, unless it was after midnight and nobody answered. He was 41, broad through the shoulders but worn at the edges, with short dark hair going gray too early at the temples and a face that seemed carved by sun, service, and the hard habit of not asking for help. People in town called him steady, reliable, the kind of man who could fix a table leg, a barn door, a busted chair, maybe even a stranger's mood if he spoke long enough in that low, careful voice of his. They did not know he had been opening the same eviction letter every morning for a week, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into mercy. His workshop, Rourke Wood and Repair, had started as a place to keep his hands busy after he came home. Then it became a place for other veterans to stop by, drink bad coffee, sand old cedar boards, talk without calling it talking. Lately it had become a room full of unfinished promises. Atlas rose before Ethan heard the truck outside. The dog did not bark. He simply stood, muscles gathering under his black and tan coat, one ear tilted toward the road. Ethan looked through the screen door and saw a white postal truck coughing dust at the end of the driveway. A minute later, an envelope landed in the mailbox with a soft metal clack that sounded somehow final. Atlas nudged Ethan's knee. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I heard it." He walked out into the heat. Late September in Red Mesa did not announce itself gently. The air shimmered above the gravel, and the mesquite trees leaned still and thirsty under a pale blue sky. Ethan pulled the envelope free and frowned. It was yellowed at the edges, thicker than ordinary mail, addressed in careful black ink to Ethan James Rourke. No company logo. No return name he recognized. Only an attorney's office in Cedar Hollow, New Mexico, a place he had driven through once years ago and forgotten before he reached the next gas station. Back inside, Atlas sniffed the envelope, then sat close enough that his shoulder pressed Ethan's boot. Ethan opened it with a pocket knife he had carried since his last deployment. The paper inside smelled faintly of dust and cedar oil. The first line stopped him cold. "Mr. Rourke, I regret to inform you that Silas Whitaker passed away on August 14 of this year." Ethan read the name twice. Silas Whitaker meant nothing to him. The letter continued in the formal voice of someone trying to make the impossible sound routine. "According to the last will and testament of Mr. Whitaker, you are the sole inheritor of Whitaker Ridge Ranch, and everything legally contained upon, beneath, or attached to the property, consisting of approximately 220 acres outside Cedar Hollow, New Mexico." Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. "Beneath?" Atlas's ears twitched. A smaller folded page slipped from the letter and landed near Ethan's coffee cup. This one was handwritten. The letters trembled slightly, as if written by a tired hand that had refused to quit. "Ethan, if this has reached you, then I ran out of time. You don't know me, but your mother did. I am leaving you the ranch, not because it is easy to keep, but because it was never meant for the wrong hands. Look for what I could not carry with me. The answer is where the old oak stands alone." Ethan's thumb tightened against the paper. His mother, Marion Rourke, had been dead 9 years. She had told him stories when he was young, soft little pieces of memory about dry country, red hills, an old windmill, a house where nobody said what they meant until it was too late. but she had never once mentioned a man named Silas Whitaker. Not once. Atlas lowered his head onto Ethan's knee, a warm weight grounding him. Outside, a raven called from the power line, harsh and lonely. Ethan stared at the bills, then at the letter, then at the dog who had followed him through airports, hospitals, nightmares, and more empty rooms than either of them deserved. A ranch, a stranger, his mother's hidden past, and an old oak waiting alone in a place he barely remembered passing through. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something move beneath the exhaustion. Not hope exactly. Hope was too bright a word. This was smaller, stranger. A match struck somewhere deep underground. He folded the handwritten note carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and looked at Atlas. "Guess we're taking a drive," he said. Atlas stood at once, tail low but steady, as if he had been waiting for that sentence all morning. By noon the next day, Ethan Rourke and Atlas were driving east under a sky so wide it made a man feel honest whether he wanted to be or not. Red Mesa fell behind them in a haze of gas stations, dry washes, and sun-faded billboards promising cheap insurance and salvation on Sunday. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other near the envelope on the passenger seat, touching it now and then as if the paper might vanish if left alone too long. Atlas rode in the back of the old Ford, sitting upright instead of lying down, his muzzle angled toward the cracked window, reading the wind the way Ethan used to read terrain. The farther they drove, the more the land changed. Arizona's rust-colored flats gave way to New Mexico's broken hills, where juniper trees clung to stone and the earth looked baked hard enough to remember every footstep ever laid upon it. Cedar Hollow appeared late in the afternoon, not so much a town as a pause in the road, a diner with 2 trucks outside, a feed store, a church bell that looked older than everyone living beneath it, a sheriff's office with a flag snapping lazily in the heat. Nobody stared when Ethan passed through, but he felt watched in the way small towns always watched, gently, completely, without apology. The road to Whitaker Ridge Ranch began behind the last row of mailboxes and turned quickly from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to something closer to memory. The truck rattled over ruts, dust rising behind them like a second vehicle. Atlas stood, paws braced, ears forward. "You smell something?" Ethan asked. The dog did not answer, of course, but his body had gone still in that particular way Ethan knew too well. Not fear, not excitement, recognition maybe, purpose. They reached the gate just before sunset. 2 leaning posts held a rusted arch with the words Whitaker Ridge welded across the top in iron letters, half hidden beneath years of sun and wind. The chain was looped but not locked. Ethan stepped out, boots crunching over brittle weeds, and pushed the gate open. It groaned like an old man clearing his throat after decades of silence. Beyond it stretched 220 acres of dry pasture, collapsed fencing, and low red hills glowing under the late light. The ranch house sat at the center of it all, weather-beaten and stubborn, its porch sagging, its windows filmed with dust. A windmill stood behind it with 2 blades missing, turning half an inch whenever the breeze remembered it. To the left was a barn with silver-gray boards and a roof patched in mismatched tin. Farther back, a small stone workshop crouched near a dry creek bed, its doorway dark as a closed mouth. Ethan looked at the place and felt the first bitter shape of disappointment. This was not rescue. This was another dying thing placed in his hands. He thought of the bank notices on his kitchen table, the cracked concrete floor of his workshop. Men who came by pretending they needed a chair repaired, when really they needed somewhere to stand without explaining themselves. He could not save that place. How was he supposed to save this one? Atlas jumped down before Ethan called him. The German shepherd did not wander toward the house or sniff the porch like a curious pet. He moved with quiet certainty across the yard, past a rusted water trough, past a coil of old fencing wire, past the windmill's crooked shadow. Ethan followed, slower, watching the dog cut through the amber grass toward the far edge of the property where one massive oak stood alone. It looked wrong there, too broad and green for land so dry, its limbs stretching outward like arms that had been waiting a long time. Atlas stopped beneath it. He lowered his nose to the ground, inhaled deeply, then looked back at Ethan, not begging, not playing, asking. Ethan felt the envelope inside his jacket, felt the handwritten words press against his ribs. The answer is where the old oak stands alone. The sun slipped lower, setting fire to the windows of the ruined ranch house behind him. For a moment, Ethan heard nothing but the wind moving through the oak leaves and Atlas breathing at his side. Then the dog lifted one paw and scraped gently at the dirt near the roots. Ethan swallowed. "All right," he whispered. "Show me what he left behind." Atlas scratched once, then stopped, as if he understood that whatever slept beneath that dry New Mexico dirt did not need force, only permission. Ethan stood under the old oak with the evening light thinning around him, one hand resting on the dog's head, the other pressed against the ache in his lower back that never quite left. After too many years of carrying weight he refused to name. The ground near the roots looked ordinary at first. Cracked soil, dead grass, a few stones pushed up by years of heat and rain. But Atlas kept his nose low, circling the same patch with careful, almost reverent focus. Ethan walked back to the truck, grabbed a short-handled shovel from behind the seat, and returned without hurrying. He had learned long ago that rushing rarely made a truth arrive faster. The first few scoops were hard, gritty, stubborn. The shovel rang against stones. Dust rose in soft brown ghosts and clung to the sweat at his neck. Atlas sat beside him, watchful, his ears turning now and then toward the ranch house, the road, the empty pasture, as if guarding not just Ethan but the silence itself. 6 inches down, the shovel struck metal. The sound was small, flat, unmistakable. Ethan froze. For a second he did not breathe. Then he knelt and brushed dirt away with his bare hands. A rusted metal box emerged from the earth, about the size of an old ammunition case, its corners eaten orange by time, its handle wrapped in what looked like cracked leather. It was not locked. That made Ethan more uneasy than if it had been. He lifted it carefully from the hole and set it between the oak's roots. Atlas leaned in, sniffed once, then backed away and sat. "Guess this part's mine," Ethan murmured. The lid resisted at first, sealed by years of dust and heat, then gave with a soft scrape. Inside was an oilcloth bundle tied with faded blue string. Ethan untied it slowly. The first thing he found was a hand-drawn map of Whitaker Ridge Ranch, precise but strange, each building sketched in dark ink, the house, the barn, the stone workshop, the dry creek bed, the windmill, the oak. 12 small marks had been drawn across the property, each one shaped like a half circle with a line through it. Beside the oak was a symbol Ethan did not recognize, something between a compass point and an old family crest. Beneath the map lay a key. It was heavier than it had any right to be, blackened with age, long-shafted, with a round bow worn smooth by someone's thumb. Ethan picked it up and felt a chill move through him despite the heat. Along the shaft were tiny engraved numbers, so fine he had to tilt the key toward the last light to see them. Not random scratches. Dates, maybe. Coordinates, maybe. A language made for one person to understand when the time was right. At the bottom of the box was a photograph, protected between 2 pieces of yellowed paper. Ethan lifted it, expecting Silas Whitaker, expecting perhaps the house as it once had been. Instead, he saw a younger man with narrow shoulders, sharp eyes, and a shy, weathered smile standing beside a woman in a denim jacket. Her hair was dark, wind-blown across her cheek, her chin lifted slightly, stubborn and tender all at once. Ethan's throat tightened before his mind caught up. He knew that face. He had seen it in hospital rooms, at kitchen sinks, in the rearview mirror of a station wagon driving away from one more military farewell. His mother, Marion Rourke, younger than he had ever known her, but unmistakably his mother. On the back of the photograph, in the same trembling hand as the letter, were 4 words and a date: Silas and Marion. October 1989. Ethan sat back on his heels. The ranch seemed to tilt around him. All his life, his mother had carried sadness like a folded letter tucked inside her chest, never shown, never thrown away. She had spoken of duty, decency, and keeping your word, but almost never of family. Now here she was, smiling beneath a New Mexico sky beside a man Ethan had never heard named. Atlas moved closer and pressed his body against Ethan's side, warm and steady. Ethan looked from the photograph to the map, from the map to the key, and finally to the oak above him, its leaves whispering in the dry wind like old voices trying not to disappear. For the first time, the inheritance did not feel like a mistake. It felt like an apology that had taken 37 years to arrive. Ethan stayed beneath the oak until the sky lost its copper edge and settled into a bruised violet dusk. He did not move right away. Some discoveries came like thunder, loud enough to knock a man backward. Others came quietly, slipped into the hand like an old photograph, and somehow weighed more. The picture of his mother rested on his knee. Silas Whitaker stood beside her in that faded square of time, both of them younger than Ethan had ever been allowed to imagine them, both of them smiling as if the world had not yet taught them the price of silence. Atlas sat close, his shoulder against Ethan's thigh, steady as a post driven deep into good earth. The dog had stopped watching the ground. Now he watched the tree. Ethan followed his gaze. In the dimming light, the oak looked less like a landmark and more like a witness. Its trunk was massive, deeply furrowed, scarred by weather and years, with roots that broke through the dry soil like the backs of buried hands. Ethan stood slowly, tucking the photograph into his shirt pocket, and ran his palm over the bark. It was rough, warm from the day's heat. Ordinary, he told himself. Just bark, just wood, just a tree old enough to outlive men who thought their secrets were permanent. Atlas rose and circled to the far side of the trunk. He sniffed once, then pressed his nose against a patch of bark, partly hidden by a low branch. Ethan stepped around after him. At first he saw nothing but shadow. Then Atlas lifted one paw and touched the tree, not scratching, not digging, just pointing. Ethan leaned closer. Beneath a thin gray veil of lichen were cuts in the bark, shallow but deliberate. He rubbed them with his thumb. Dust came loose, lines appeared, not random wounds from age, marks. The same symbol from the map, carved long ago and weathered almost smooth. A half circle crossed by a straight line, like a rising sun held down by memory. Below it were letters. S.W. Ethan's breath caught so sharply Atlas looked up at him. Silas Whitaker and Marion Rourke. His mother's initials, carved into a tree on land she had never mentioned, beside the name of a man she had carried in silence to her grave. Ethan touched the letters as if they might flinch. His mother had been practical to the point of tenderness. She folded grocery bags because waste bothered her. She wrote thank you notes in blue ink. She could make soup out of almost nothing, and somehow make a house feel less empty when there was rain on the roof. But she had also possessed a talent for closing doors gently and locking them without sound. Ethan had spent years believing her silence meant pain. Now he wondered if it had also meant protection. Atlas nosed higher along the trunk. Ethan shifted his flashlight from his belt and clicked it on. The beam caught another carving, smaller, nearly swallowed by bark, grown thick around it. He brushed carefully, then read the words aloud in a voice that did not quite belong to him. Some inherit land. Some inherit what the land remembers. The wind moved through the leaves overhead, dry and silver. Ethan closed his eyes. He could almost hear his mother laughing somewhere far back in time, before illness thinned her voice, before military departures taught both of them how to hug quickly, before grief made every old question feel impolite. He wanted suddenly and fiercely to ask her everything. Why did you leave? Who was he to you? What were you afraid would find us if you told me the truth? But the dead answered in fragments. A letter, a key, a photograph, a dog refusing to look away from a tree. Atlas gave a low, soft sound, not a growl, more like concern. Ethan opened his eyes and placed his hand on the shepherd's head. I know, he whispered. I'm listening. That was the first honest thing he had said to the ranch. The old oak stood above them, holding its carvings, its shade, its waiting. Ethan understood then that Silas had not simply left directions. He had left a test of attention. The ranch would not reveal itself to a man in a hurry or to a man looking only for money. It would open, piece by piece, to someone willing to kneel in the dirt and read what others had passed by. Ethan looked once more at the initials SW plus MAR. For 37 years, sun and wind had tried to erase them. They had failed. Something in Ethan, tired and long defended, loosened by the smallest degree. Maybe his mother had not abandoned this place. Maybe she had entrusted it to time. Maybe Silas had been waiting, not for a buyer, not for a collector, but for the one person who would see the carving and understand that memory itself could be an inheritance. The ranch house did not welcome Ethan so much as tolerate him. Its front door opened with a tired inward sigh, releasing the smell of dust, sun-warmed pine, and something older underneath. The faint mineral scent of rooms that had been closed around memory for too long. Atlas entered first. He crossed the threshold without fear, paws quiet on the warped floorboards, nose low, tail level, reading the house in a language Ethan could only respect from a distance. The place had once been loved. He could tell by the practical details that survived the neglect. Hooks near the door for coats, a narrow shelf for work gloves, a hand-built bench beneath the window, where someone had probably removed muddy boots before stepping into the kitchen. Time had taken the polish, but not the intention. Ethan moved slowly from room to room, flashlight cutting through suspended dust. The kitchen sink was dry and stained with rust. A chipped blue mug sat upside down near the stove, as if Silas had washed it one last time and decided the world could continue without him. In the sitting room, a faded rug held the outline of furniture long removed. On the wall hung a nail with nothing on it. Ethan stared at that empty nail longer than he meant to. Grief, he had learned, was not always the thing missing. Sometimes it was the shape left behind. Atlas disappeared down the hall. A moment later came one sharp bark, not alarm, a summons. Ethan followed it to a back bedroom where the air felt cooler, shaded by a mesquite tree brushing the window. The room was bare except for an iron bed frame, a cracked mirror, and a cedar wardrobe standing crooked against the wall. Atlas lay near the window, with his front paws stretched toward a section of floor. He looked up at Ethan, then down again. "You're sure?" Ethan asked softly. Atlas tapped the board once with his paw. Ethan almost smiled. "Of course you are." He knelt and ran his fingers along the seam. One board sat higher than the rest, barely enough to notice unless a person had reason to be looking. He used the pocket knife to pry it loose. The wood lifted with a dry pop. Beneath it, tucked between two joists, was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with the same faded blue string as the box beneath the oak. Ethan pulled it free and sat back against the wall. His hands were steady until he opened it. Inside was a leather journal, dark brown, cracked along the spine, its pages swollen slightly from years of desert air. On the first page, in Silas Whitaker's careful hand, were the words, "For the one Marion believed would come when the land was ready." Ethan read them twice before turning the page. The entries began nearly 40 years earlier. Silas wrote like a man who had no one left to speak to but refused to let the truth die without a witness. He wrote of Marion as his half-sister, though the words seemed too small for the tenderness beneath it. Same mother, different fathers, raised under the same roof until pride and poverty split the family like dry timber. Marion had left after an argument about selling the ranch. Silas had stayed, stubborn and ashamed, believing land could be guarded if love could not. Ethan found his own name halfway through the journal, written when he would have been 5 years old. Marion came by today. She worries about the boy. Says he watches everything and speaks only when the words matter. She says he has a soldier's heart. Though God willing, he will never have to become one. Ethan's chest tightened. Atlas rested his chin on Ethan's boot. The pages turned: estate sales, bank auctions, old coin shows in Denver, Dallas, Santa Fe. Silas had spent decades collecting rare American coins. Not recklessly, but with devotion. Each purchase documented, each story preserved. A 1916D Mercury dime found in a cigar box from Colorado Springs. A St. Gaudens double eagle purchased through a private estate. A 1933 double eagle mentioned with such awe that Ethan could almost see Silas holding his breath over it. One line stopped him completely. The collection is near 140 million now, but it is worthless in the hands of anyone who sees only price. History must be held by someone who respects the hands it passed through. Ethan lowered the journal. Outside, the wind nudged the old house and made it creak like a ship at anchor. He had spent months thinking poverty had made him small. Silas, dead and dust-covered and stubborn as stone, had just placed a different measure in his hands. Not money, not yet, responsibility. Ethan had just closed Silas Whitaker's journal when Atlas lifted his head toward the window. The dog did not bark. He went very still, ears angled forward, body tense in that quiet, disciplined way Ethan trusted more than any alarm system ever built. A vehicle was coming up the ranch road. Ethan heard it a moment later. Tires grinding over gravel, engine too smooth for a local truck, too confident for someone lost. He slipped the journal back into the oilcloth, tucked it inside his field bag, and stepped onto the porch as a black SUV rolled through the open gate, raising a pale curtain of dust behind it. The vehicle stopped beside the old windmill, polished so clean it looked offended by the dirt around it. The man who stepped out wore a navy suit despite the heat, brown leather shoes, and a smile that arrived before the rest of his face did. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, lean, with the soft hands of a man who signed papers for a living and called it work. "Mr. Rourke," he said, as if they had been expected to meet. "Victor Langford, Horizon Mesa Development." Ethan did not move down the steps. Atlas stood beside him, close enough that Ethan felt the dog's shoulder brush his leg. "Long way out for a handshake," Ethan said. Victor laughed lightly, the kind of laugh meant to make other people feel unsophisticated for not joining in. "I was in the county office this morning. Heard the Whitaker property had finally transferred. Thought I'd save us both some time." His gaze swept over the ranch house, the barn, the windmill, the empty pasture. "Not with curiosity, with inventory. Beautiful in its way," Victor continued. "But I imagine you've already noticed the problems: bad soil, old structures, water rights tangled in paperwork, access road needs grading, environmental surveys would be a headache. Frankly, this place can swallow a man whole if he isn't careful." Ethan watched him speak. There was polish in every sentence, but no warmth beneath it. Men like Victor did not insult a place directly. They dressed the insult as advice and waited for gratitude. "You always visit strangers with a full property assessment?" Ethan asked. Victor's smile did not falter, though something in his eyes tightened. "When I see a veteran about to inherit more trouble than he deserves, I pay attention. I have great respect for service." That last word landed too neatly. Ethan had heard it before from people who admired uniforms as long as the person inside them stayed useful, quiet, and inexpensive. Victor reached into a leather folder and pulled out a document clipped with a silver pen. "My company is prepared to offer $75,000 cash for the entire parcel. As no inspections, no delays. You sign, we absorb the burden, and you walk away clean." Atlas made a low sound in his chest. Not a threat, a warning, old and measured. Victor glanced at the dog, then back at Ethan. "Handsome animal. He has good instincts," Ethan said. Victor's smile thinned. "Then perhaps he understands opportunity." Ethan looked past him toward the oak, now dark against the fading gold of the pasture. In his field bag, the journal seemed to gain weight. $140 million, Silas had written. But the number was not what held Ethan in place. It was the sentence after it. "Worthless in the hands of anyone who sees only price." Victor took one careful step closer, lowering his voice. "Mr. Rourke, I know men like you. Proud, tired, trying to rebuild with a hammer and a prayer. There's dignity in knowing when to let go." Ethan felt something cold move through him, not anger exactly, but clarity. Victor had not come to buy land. He had come to buy exhaustion. He had come hoping Ethan would mistake pressure for mercy. Ethan descended one step, then another, until he stood level with the man in the dust. Atlas came with him. "Mr. Langford," Ethan said quietly, "dignity isn't something you offer a man at a discount." For the first time, Victor's perfect smile disappeared. Only for a second. But Ethan saw it, the real man beneath the polish, calculating, impatient, afraid of delay. Then the mask returned. "Think carefully. This offer expires tomorrow at noon." Ethan folded the paper without reading the rest and handed it back. "Then I guess noon will have to learn disappointment." Victor accepted the document slowly. He looked once toward the oak before getting into his SUV, and that glance told Ethan more than the entire conversation. Atlas watched the vehicle disappear down the road, dust settling behind it like a curtain closing. Ethan placed his hand on the shepherd's back and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing. The ranch was no longer quiet, it was being watched, and now Ethan knew by whom. After Victor Langford's SUV vanished beyond the gate, the ranch did not feel empty anymore. It felt awake. Ethan stood in the settling dust with Atlas beside him, watching the road long after the taillights were gone. The air had cooled, but the heat of the day still rose from the ground in slow, invisible waves. Somewhere near the barn, a loose strip of tin tapped softly in the evening breeze, steady as a nervous finger. Ethan returned to the house, took Silas's journal from the field bag, and sat at the kitchen table beneath a light fixture that no longer worked. He used his flashlight instead, laying the map, the heavy black key, and the photograph of his mother side by side. Atlas settled at his feet, but he did not sleep. His ears remained turned toward the door. Ethan opened the journal to the pages after the coin entries. Silas's handwriting had grown smaller there, tighter, as if the old man had begun to feel time leaning over his shoulder. One sentence had been underlined twice: 30 paces north, 20 west, 6 feet down. Ethan looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the old oak was a black shape against the last blue of the sky. "You already knew," he said to Atlas. The dog lifted his head, calm and certain. Ethan found a digging bar in the stone workshop and a square shovel in the barn. He worked by truck headlights. counting from the oak with the care of a man disarming memory. 30 paces north, 20 west. Atlas walked with him, nose near the dirt, then stopped at a patch of earth where the grass grew thinner than anywhere else. Ethan drove the shovel in. The soil resisted, packed hard by years of drought, but he kept going, not fast, not frantic. Each scoop felt like a question asked of the dead. An hour later, the shovel struck something solid. This time the sound was deeper than the metal box had been, a dull iron note that seemed to travel up Ethan's arms and settle behind his ribs. He cleared the dirt with his hands. A steel hatch emerged, broad and round-edged, set into a concrete collar beneath the earth. At its center was an old lock plate, dark with age but untouched by rust, as if Silas had built it to wait longer than weather could endure. Ethan took out the key. It fit. For one bright second, hope rose too quickly in him. He turned it. The lock clicked. The hatch shifted half an inch, then stopped. Beneath the first mechanism were 3 numbered dials protected by a sliding brass cover. Ethan stared at them, then laughed once under his breath. Not bitterly this time, almost with respect. "Of course," he said. "You didn't make it easy." Atlas sniffed the dials, then moved away from the hatch toward the oak. Ethan followed, journal in hand. He read the next line by flashlight. Important dates make the best passwords. Birth, loss, homecoming, forgiveness. The words landed in him one at a time. Birth, his mother's birthday. He knew that, June 12, 1958. Loss, his father's death, or Silas's mother? Homecoming, Ethan's discharge date? The day he returned to Arizona with Atlas limping from an injury and himself pretending not to be broken. Forgiveness. That one unsettled him most. He went back to the trunk where SW plus Mar was carved. Atlas pressed his nose to a strip of bark higher up, half hidden behind a knotted swell in the wood. Ethan brushed away lichen and found faint numbers cut flat by time, a 61258. Beneath it, another, 11031. Then a third, 042216. The fourth was not a number. It was a word, carved so lightly he nearly missed it. Home. Ethan stood very still. November 3, 2019. The day his mother had died. April 22, 2016. The day he had come home from his final deployment and found Atlas waiting for him at the rehabilitation center. Tail sweeping slowly, eyes full of recognition no doctor could prescribe. Ethan returned to the hatch and entered the numbers with trembling fingers. The first dial opened, then the second, then the third. For the final lock, he turned the letters to HOME. The mechanism released with a soft, breath-like sound. Atlas stepped close, not ahead of him this time, but beside him. Ethan pulled the hatch open. Cool air rose from below, carrying the scent of stone, cedar, and something metallic that had slept in darkness for years. A narrow ladder descended into the earth. Ethan aimed the flashlight down, and the beam caught wooden crates stacked carefully along the walls, each one marked in Silas's hand. He did not climb down right away. He simply stood there beneath the open sky, with his dog at his side and his mother's initials behind him, understanding at last that the key had never been enough. The lock had required memory. Ethan descended the ladder slowly, one boot at a time, with Atlas waiting above the open hatch like a sentry carved from shadow and loyalty. The air below was cool enough to raise gooseflesh along Ethan's forearms. His flashlight beam moved across stone walls, cedar shelving, and wooden crates stacked with a precision that felt almost military. Silas Whitaker had not hidden things in panic. He had arranged them with patience, with intention, with the quiet stubbornness of a man who believed the future deserved order, even if he would not live to see it. Ethan reached the floor and stood still for a moment, listening. No hum of electricity, no sound from the house. Only his own breathing and the faint scrape of Atlas shifting above him, unwilling to leave his partner beyond sight. The first crate bore a handwritten label, U.S.-type coins, Verify. Inside were valve-lined trays wrapped in wax paper. Ethan lifted one carefully and saw rows of old silver and gold coins, each tucked into a protective holder, each labeled by year, mint mark, condition, and source. Some had notes attached in Silas's handwriting. Bought from Mrs. Hanley after her husband passed. Paid above asking. She needed roof repairs. Another read. Found in estate lot. Seller unaware. Returned twice to confirm fair value. Ethan stared at that line longer than he expected. The coins were beautiful. Yes, but the notes were what hollowed him out. Silas had not been hunting fools. He had been guarding dignity, even in transactions where nobody would have known the difference. In the second crate, Ethan found a leather-bound inventory nearly 3 inches thick. Photographs, certificates, auction records, appraisals from firms in Dallas, Denver, and New York. Names of numismatic experts, tax attorneys, insurance contacts, museum consultants. Then, tucked beneath the inventory, a smaller notebook with a red cloth cover. On the first page, Silas had written, "Ethan, wealth attracts 2 kinds of people, those who respect what you carry, and those who hope you do not understand its weight. Start with the names in this book. Trust slowly, verify everything." Ethan sat on an upturned crate and let those words settle over him. His whole life, pride had taught him to endure quietly. Service had taught him to decide quickly. Poverty had taught him that delay could cost a man everything. But Silas was teaching him a different lesson from the grave. When something is valuable, haste becomes a doorway for thieves wearing polite shoes. A sound came from above. Atlas gave one low bark. Ethan looked up. The dog had moved to the edge of the hatch, head angled toward the pasture. "I'm coming," Ethan called. Before climbing out, his flashlight caught a second map pinned to the back wall behind a sheet of canvas. He pulled it free. This map was cleaner than the first, drawn later, with 12 numbered circles spread across the ranch, the dry creek bed, the barn foundation, the stone workshop, the windmill, the old well, the north ridge, and 6 more places marked only by symbols. At the bottom was another note. "The first chamber proves the story. The rest protects it. Do not gather everything until the right witnesses are present." Ethan folded the map with care, slipped the red notebook into his jacket, and climbed back into the night. Atlas met him at the top, then turned his head toward the ranch road. Far off, beyond the gate, dust hung in the moonlight where no vehicle could yet be seen. Ethan's stomach tightened. Victor Langford's deadline had not expired. But men like Victor rarely waited for clocks when greed had already started speaking. Ethan closed the hatch, brushed dirt across the steel, and stood beneath the oak with the map against his chest. He understood now that the treasure was not a single buried room. It was a system, a history, a responsibility spread across land, law, memory, and trust. Atlas leaned against him, warm and steady. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck and looked toward the dark outline of the ranch house. For the first time since opening the letter, he did not ask what Silas had left him. He asked what kind of man Silas had believed he could become. The dust beyond the gate thickened before the engine came into view, and Ethan felt the old ranch tighten around him, as if every board, stone, and root had been waiting for this exact hour. Atlas stood at his side beneath the oak, head low, eyes fixed on the road, not restless, not afraid, simply ready. The black SUV returned first, rolling through the gate without invitation, followed by a silver sedan and a white pickup marked with the logo of Horizon Mesa Development. Victor Langford stepped out wearing a pale linen jacket this time, as if dressing lighter could make his purpose less heavy. 2 people came with him, one carrying a leather briefcase, the other holding a tablet and a folder of printed forms. No raised voices, no threats. That made it worse somehow. Greed did not always arrive shouting, sometimes it arrived notarized. "Mr. Rourke," Victor said, looking toward the ranch house, then the oak, then the disturbed soil near Ethan's boots. His smile appeared, perfect and empty. "I had a feeling you might reconsider." Ethan rested one hand on Atlas's back. The dog's breathing was steady under his palm. "You said noon." Victor glanced at his watch. "And I thought I'd be courteous enough to arrive early." "That's not courtesy." Ethan's voice stayed low. "That's pressure." Something flickered across Victor's face, there and gone. "Pressure is a harsh word. I prefer clarity. This property is complicated, and frankly, you're standing in the middle of legal and financial matters you may not be equipped to handle." The woman beside him opened the briefcase and removed a purchase agreement, already tabbed for signatures. Victor continued, softer now, almost kind. "You served your country. You've earned peace, not paperwork. Sign today, and I'll make sure the payment clears before the bank can touch your workshop." Ethan looked at the paper. For one brief, dangerous second, he saw his shop floor back in Red Mesa. The veterans who came by pretending they only wanted coffee. The unpaid lease. The hollow ache of failing people who had trusted him without saying so. Victor had chosen the right wound. That was his talent. Atlas moved half a step forward and gave one quiet bark, sharp enough to cut the air. Victor's eyes narrowed. Before he could speak, another vehicle approached the gate. Then another, a county cruiser, a dark government sedan, a dusty blue truck with the seal of New Mexico Estate Services on the door. Victor turned slowly, his smile did not return. A woman in a tan blazer stepped from the government sedan, tall, composed, with gray at her temples and a badge clipped discreetly at her belt. Behind her came an older black man in a charcoal suit carrying a document case, and a woman in work boots with a Heritage National Auctions badge hanging from her neck. The woman in the blazer walked straight to Ethan. "Mr. Rourke?" "Deputy U.S. Marshal Grace Holloway. Silas Whitaker instructed us to make contact if Victor Langford appeared on this property after transfer of title." Victor's face went still, not shocked, exposed. The older man opened his case. "Nathaniel Price, estate attorney. Mr. Whitaker retained my firm 4 years ago. He anticipated an undervalued purchase attempt and placed conditions on the estate to prevent coercive acquisition." Ethan felt the words enter him slowly. 4 years ago. Silas had seen this coming. The auction specialist nodded toward the oak. "We also hold preliminary authentication records for the Whitaker collection. Estimated value, subject to full verification, approximately $148 million. For a moment, even the wind seemed to step back. Victor's assistant lowered the unsigned papers. Victor looked at Ethan, and without the smile, he seemed smaller, older, less like a man in control and more like a man whose map had failed him. Marshal Holloway turned to him. "Mr. Langford, your prior communications with Mr. Whitaker, along with similar purchase patterns involving elderly landowners and financially distressed heirs, are under review. You are free to leave. You are not free to interfere." No one moved for a breath. Then Victor took back the papers, folded them with hands that were careful but no longer calm, and walked to his SUV. Ethan watched him go, feeling no triumph, only relief, and beneath it, something quieter. The strange mercy of being protected by someone he had never met in life. As the vehicles disappeared down the road, Nathaniel Price handed Ethan a sealed envelope. On it, in Silas's handwriting, was one line: "For Ethan, when he learns the land was never the treasure by itself." Ethan opened it with Atlas pressed against his leg. Inside, Silas had written, "I did not leave this to you because you were blood. I left it because Marion believed you would know what to do with something valuable, without forgetting people who have none." Ethan bowed his head. Under the old oak, with law, memory, and loyalty gathered around him, he finally understood. Silas had not only hidden a fortune, he had built a shield around dignity. 6 months later, Whitaker Ridge Ranch no longer looked like a place waiting to be forgotten. Morning came over Cedar Hollow in long bands of gold, spilling across repaired fence lines, fresh gravel paths, and the wide front porch Ethan had rebuilt with his own hands. The windmill still turned slowly behind the house, not perfectly, but honestly, creaking now and then like an old friend clearing his throat. The barn roof had been mended. The stone workshop had new windows. The old oak stood where it always had, broader somehow in the clean light, its scars still visible, its initials untouched. Ethan had left them that way. Some things were not meant to be polished smooth. Some things deserved to show they had endured. The auction had taken place in Dallas under lights, so bright Ethan felt, at first as if the coins had been dragged out of one kind of darkness into another. Experts spoke in low voices. Collectors leaned close without touching. Cameras flashed. Numbers climbed in a language Ethan still did not fully trust. When the final settlements cleared after taxes, fees, appraisals, insurance, and legal obligations, the Whitaker collection had brought in just over $150 million. The figure stunned the newspapers. It changed Ethan's bank account. But it did not change the way Atlas nudged his hand each morning at 5:40, asking for breakfast as if wealth were a temporary human confusion, and kibble remained the true foundation of civilization. Ethan paid off the workshop in Red Mesa first. Then he paid the debts of the men who had kept showing up there with broken chairs and unspoken grief. He did not make speeches about it. He simply wrote checks, shook hands, and let people keep their pride. After that, he did what Silas had asked without asking. He turned the ranch into the Whitaker Rourke Veterans Workshop, a place where former service members could come without needing to explain what they had lost. In the stone building, they learned woodworking, metal repair, leatherwork, equipment maintenance, and the slower art of staying in a room with other people without pretending to be fine. The barn became a rescue stable for neglected horses brought in through county programs. The old bunkhouse became temporary housing for men and women trying to get their footing again. A small legal office opened beside the kitchen, offering free consultations to heirs, retirees, widows, farmers, and veterans who had been pressured to sell what they did not yet understand. On the wall above the desk hung one sentence from Silas's red notebook: "A thing has value only when the owner is respected enough to understand it." Ethan read that line often. He read it on days when donors arrived with cameras and expected gratitude to perform on cue. He read it when a retired mechanic cried quietly over a cup of coffee because someone had called him useful again. He read it when he found Atlas asleep beneath the oak, one paw resting near the place where the first metal box had been buried. The dog had grown a little grayer around the muzzle, but his eyes remained clear, steady, and annoyingly certain. People visiting the ranch liked to say Atlas had found the treasure. Ethan always corrected them. "He found the way to it," he would say. There's a difference. On the first anniversary of Silas Whitaker's passing, Ethan stood beneath the oak at sunset with the photograph of Marion and Silas in his hand. He had placed a small brass plaque near the trunk, simple and unvarnished, in memory of Silas Whitaker and Marion Rourke, who believed dignity could be inherited, protected, and passed on. Atlas sat beside him, shoulder pressed against his leg the way he had on the first night. Ethan looked across the ranch. In the workshop, sawdust floated through open doors. Someone laughed near the barn. A hammer struck wood in a patient rhythm. Nothing grand, nothing polished for television. Just people building things again, and maybe being built in return. Ethan touched the carved initials in the bark. For years, he had thought inheritance meant receiving what someone left behind. Now he knew better. Inheritance was what you chose to carry forward. Silas had left land, coins, maps, locks, and names written in careful ink. Marion had left silence, faith, and a son she trusted more than she ever told him. Atlas had given him the one thing no document could provide: the courage to follow where love was trying to lead. Ethan folded the photograph and slipped it into his pocket. The sun dropped behind the ridge, turning the dry grass bronze. He rested his hand on Atlas's head and let the quiet come without fighting it. He had inherited a ranch. He had uncovered a fortune. But what saved him was simpler, older, and harder to appraise. The truth that every person, no matter how worn down, deserves to be seen with respect before anyone decides what they are worth. If this story touched you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. And I'd love to know, what moments stayed with you most? Atlas finding the old oak, Ethan opening the hidden chamber, or the truth Silas left behind?